Around noon on May 29, 1975, a 26-year-old man named Homer B. Lawyer Jr. left the store where he worked as a shoe salesman in Miami, Florida for his lunch break, and he walked down the street. He tried not to rush or look like he was in a hurry, but the truth was, he was extremely antsy as he walked along here. And the reason for that is he knew that soon he would either be rich or in jail. Because Homer was actually on his way to rob his very first bank. So Homer had decided that he was done being a shoe salesman. He didn't make nearly enough money, and it was just so boring. I mean, every single day felt the same, and again, there's like no money in it. And so for the last couple of weeks, Homer had been trying to think of a way to make lots of money really quickly that might also be kind of exciting along the way. Hence how he landed on robbing a bank. And it just so happened there was a bank right around the corner from his work that he decided would be his first target. Now, Homer was aware that he was brand new to robbing banks here, so, before he actually stepped out to go do this thing, he'd put a lot of thought into how to actually do it. He'd spent days preparing for this by mulling over and scribbling down ideas and plans until he'd finally landed on what he felt was the best way to pull this thing off. And so now, as he rounded the corner and he saw the bank up ahead, his stomach fluttered with nerves, but he took a breath and told himself that he had a solid plan in place, and the risk was definitely going to be worth the reward. Seconds later, Homer walked into the mostly empty bank with one hand in his pocket. He had a finger stretched out so that it looked like he had a weapon in his pocket, a gun. But he was not armed. He was just hoping to fool people into thinking he was armed. And so with his hand conspicuously located in his pocket, he headed over to the short line where one other customer was at the counter being helped by the only bank teller on duty. And so Homer, doing his best to stay calm, he waited his turn. And then when the other customer was done and had left the bank, Homer walked up to the teller and handed her a note that said he had a gun and he was robbing this bank. And now she just needed to give him all the cash in her register. Homer watched as the teller read this note and then got this terrified look on her face, like it suddenly sunk in what was happening here. Then, as calmly as she could, because now she was really frightened and very on edge, she set the note aside, and then with shaking hands, she unlocked a drawer and began pulling out all these stacks of bills from inside of it. And then when she was done pulling all this cash out, she put it into a bag and then slid the bag over to Homer. And for a second, Homer just stared at this bag. At first he was just totally thrilled that his plan had even worked here. He was confident, but this is amazing. I can't believe this is going so well. But he quickly snapped out of his, elation here, and he realized that, the bank robbery is far from over here. Like right now, he needs to take this money and get out of here as fast as he can. So he grabbed the bag with his free hand. He's still got the other hand in his pocket, pretending there's a gun there. He grabs the bag, he turns, and he sprints out of the bank. And as soon as he was outside, he just kept on running until he was a few blocks away. And at that point, he stopped and he turned around to look and to listen. But amazingly, there weren't any police following him, or he didn't see any. And there weren't any sirens in the distance. And so Homer relaxed because he knew he was safe and that he'd been right to give robbing banks a try. He was a natural. And now there was no way he'd be going back to his boring shoe sales job ever again. The next day, when Homer woke up, he felt the best he had ever felt in his life. This successful robbery was like the best thing he had ever done. And so with a big grin on his face, he decided he would leave his house and he would head out and treat himself to a nice, expensive breakfast, and maybe then after that, go spend some more of that new hard-earned money on whatever he wanted, because he was rich now. So with a pep in his step, he walked around the house, he got himself dressed and ready to go, and then he headed out the front door, out onto the street. But as soon as he did, he found himself completely surrounded by a swarm of Miami police officers and FBI agents. So it would turn out, somewhat unbelievably, that Homer was not actually a natural at robbing banks. He had robbed a bank in broad daylight, close to his work, and without even wearing a mask or any sort of disguise. He had just sort of gone in there and done it. And while those are all things that could have gotten him caught, and likely would have gotten him caught, The actual reason he got caught so quickly after the robbery was because of one very avoidable and truly just completely idiotic mistake that he made. So when Homer fled the bank, he was so intent on getting out of there as fast as he could that he had forgotten to grab the note that he had given to the teller with him. He had left it on the counter. That note had been written on the back of some scrap paper that Homer had been using in the days prior to the robbery to scribble down all his ideas and thoughts about the robbery. And one of the things that Homer, in all his thoroughness, had written down on that scrap piece of paper included his own extremely distinctive name. So, when the investigators arrived at the bank to take the teller's statement, the one who was actually robbed by Homer, and try to collect some evidence, the bank teller literally just handed them that note with the robber's full name on it, and also clearly their intention to come and rob this bank. Like, it was basically, my name is Homer and I'm gonna rob this bank, here's how I'm gonna do it. Like, that's what he gave the teller, in essence. And so using that note, the police located Homer pretty much immediately and arrested him. Our next story is called The Destiny Ring. On an afternoon in early June of 1938, a 21-year-old actor named Jack Dunn paced nervously around the lobby of a film studio in Los Angeles, California, waiting to be called into the next room. Jack was incredibly anxious, and as he paced around, he kept stopping in front of this mirror to adjust his outfit and fiddle with the ring on his finger. So Jack was actually being considered for a lead role in a major motion picture, and he was about to do this one final audition. This one would be on camera, to prove to the film's producers that he was the guy for the job and not the others. And this was a job that Jack not only wanted, but he desperately needed it. Even though Jack was young, he had been trying to make it as an actor out here in Hollywood for years, but everything he'd auditioned for or had actually been cast in had invariably fallen through. So he hadn't actually been in a movie yet. And so he was starting to feel like if he didn't get a big break soon, he would literally just run out of money, and then he'd have to go back to England where he was from. But if he got this part, the one he was auditioning for today, there was no question in his mind that it would launch him not just into a viable career out here in Hollywood, but perhaps superstardom. Because this film was a biopic about the life of this Italian actor, Rudolph Valentino, who was a massive movie star from the 1920s who'd had millions and millions of obsessive fans. And he was considered at the time to be like the biggest sex symbol in Hollywood. Now, Rudolph had unfortunately died young and sort of unexpectedly at just 31 years old from this sudden illness. But his sudden passing had actually made him even more legendary and more beloved. So this was like a very iconic film to be involved with. Now, Jack had never met or gotten to know Rudolph, but from what he'd heard about him, they had a lot in common. They were both tall, dark, and handsome, and they were both immigrants and accomplished athletes. Jack had been an ice skater, and Rudolph had been a dancer. Now, Jack hoped the producers also could see these similarities as well. But he knew even if they did, that still wouldn't be enough to get him the part. Rudolph was singular and special, and so Jack really needed to actually become him if he wanted a shot at this role. So today, for this screen test, Jack had dressed up like Rudolph and put on a very expensive, flashy outfit, since that's the kind of thing that Rudolph liked to wear. And Jack had even gone one step further and managed to get a hold of this vintage ring that Rudolph himself had actually owned. It had this huge yellow stone and this really ornate platinum setting. And apparently, at some point in the history of this ring, in part because Rudolph had owned it, it had gotten this sort of over-the-top nickname. It was called the Destiny Ring. And now, Jack hoped that by wearing this Destiny Ring, that it would help him sort of get the role that he felt destined to play. And so now, as he looked into the mirror for the umpteenth time and checked his hair and his outfit, he heard the door open and the producer's voice called out, asking if Jack was ready. Jack took one last deep breath and then silently told himself that once he walked out of this lobby, he was no longer Jack Dunn. He was Rudolph Valentino. Then he straightened his shoulders, he adjusted his destiny ring, and followed the producer through the doorway. And wouldn't you know it, just a few days later, almost every paper in Hollywood had a new headline. Newcomer Jack Dunn has been cast as the icon Rudolph Valentino. He got the part. At the end of June, so now about 2 weeks after Jack officially got the part, he was out in the California desert, less than 100 miles from Los Angeles, and he was carrying a rifle through some brush. So ever since Jack had been officially cast as Rudolph, his life had become a whirlwind. The movie was set to shoot in the fall, but he was already getting a ton of attention and lots of press about his casting. However, to Jack's surprise, a lot of this attention was pretty negative. The media seemed to think that Jack himself was just too inexperienced to handle playing someone as famous and iconic as Rudolph. And also, Jack had received literally thousands of letters from Rudolph's fans who had basically said the same thing, only more rudely. Now, Jack had always coveted, the life of famous actors and actresses who were in the public eye, but he had never been in the public eye. And so this criticism had been really hard to hear, like he wasn't used to this. But the criticism had also made him want to prove the naysayers wrong here. So ever since getting cast, Jack had been working even harder on this role. Like he had really tried to become Rudolph Valentino, to really show that he could do this. And so after being cast, he just kept on dressing like Rudolph. He'd used Rudolph's dance moves at clubs and actually invented a dance that he called the Valentino Rumba. He'd also started dating around, sort of seeing a bunch of women all the time, just like apparently Rudolph had. Like he was trying to really be this guy. And today, sort of in keeping with this trend, Jack had come all the way out here to the desert to hunt, which had been a hobby of Rudolph's. And so Jack, he's trudging across the desert landscape, trying to act like this hardened hunter that he really wasn't. And at some point, he looked down at his hand, and he saw there was a tick that was actually on his hand near where his destiny ring was. Now, the tick had not bit him yet, and so quickly, Jack squeezed his hand and crushed it with his thumb against Rudolph's destiny ring. Fast forward a few days. Jack has now come back home. He's back to fully pretending to be Rudolph, and he's getting ready to shoot that fall. Like he's doing all the things he's supposed to be doing, but he started to feel like he was having a hard time being able to focus. Like it was like every time he tried to work, it's like his mind would just wander. And he started to realize what was going on here is he was getting sick. He could sort of feel it coming on. And then shortly after that, one of his eyes got really swollen and his throat became raw. And then he had this really bad fever. And then not long after that, he became completely delirious, like just out of his mind. And so it was around this time where it's like Jack is losing touch with reality that he knew, his acting career really needed to be set aside. For now, he needed to go to the hospital. And so Jack, he goes to the hospital, and as soon as he is admitted, his condition only got worse. Like no matter what they did, it's like they could not stop whatever was happening to him. And he declined really quickly, to the point where it was clear Jack's body was shutting down. And even though the doctors, the nurses, the staff did everything they could to try to save him, about a week after being admitted to the hospital, he died. So when Jack was out hunting, doing his best Rudolph impersonation, well, that tick that he saw on his hand that he ultimately killed by crushing against the destiny ring, well, he was smart to kill it because it was infected with this rare illness called tularemia. And it had not bit him yet, so it was like he saved himself by crushing this tick, right? Except later that day, like after he got back, he rubbed his eye with his fist and his destiny ring, and the guts of that tick and this disease were still on the ring. And so he basically rubbed it directly into his eyeball, and then it got into his bloodstream, and that literally killed him. And so in a weird way, that destiny ring, which had become such a part of Jack's identity as he took on this persona as Rudolph, it's like the ring kinda is the reason he died. Like the ring is the mechanism by which he got this disease. But it actually goes much deeper. So the Destiny Ring was famous not just because Rudolph Valentino had at one time owned it, but also because the Destiny Ring was said to be cursed. Specifically, that the owner of the ring, the possessor of this Destiny Ring, could potentially be killed. Basically, the curse could kill them. And so it's very likely that Rudolph Valentino was aware of the lore behind this ring because he was known to collect superstitious objects. He didn't believe in things like curses, but he really liked things that had sort of scary lore around them. And so he very likely bought this ring in part because it was cursed. But then he dies this sudden, tragic death when he's really young while wearing this ring. And it only added to the lore of this ring. And then from there, the ring did not go directly to Jack Dunn. No, there were three people in the middle. There was a radio star, a singer, and a burglar who all possessed this ring following Rudolph. And each of them, while wearing the ring, died sudden, unexpected deaths. And then finally, the ring winds up on Jack Dunn's finger, who's playing the role of Rudolph Valentino, and he too would die a sudden, unexpected, tragic death young while wearing the Destiny Ring. Since Jack Dunn's death, the Destiny Ring has seemingly disappeared, and nobody knows who has it now, or whether they know about the curse. Our next story is called Striking It Rich. One afternoon in the summer of 1909, a man named Andrew Dunn knelt inside of a wooden shack just outside the very remote town of Gowgonda, Canada, taking sticks of dynamite out of a crate. And Andrew was really excited because he was about to use this dynamite to get at this huge deposit of silver that would make him and his team very rich. So Andrew was a miner, and up until recently, he'd been living in this town called Cobalt, which was about 100 miles east of where they were right now, and was famous for its very lucrative silver mines. Andrew had made a ton of money there, but recently, Cobalt had been overrun by other miners also trying to get rich. So Andrew and two of his friends from Cobalt had come out to this more remote area where they'd been able to find these new, untouched silver deposits. And this one that they had just found would be their biggest haul so far. And so, very excitedly, Andrew continues pulling out all this dynamite until he has enough, at which point he scoops it all up, and he leaves the shack, and he walks over to where his partners are standing in front of all these huge rocks that they're gonna blow up to get to the silver. And so he goes over and he hands out the dynamite, and they place them strategically in the rocks and tether them all together to a single fuse. And then when they're ready, they light the lead fuse that would burn into all the dynamite. So they have a little bit of a lead time here. They light the fuse and they all turn and they run over to the shack where they're gonna take cover. They get inside, they're behind the wall, they crouch down and they're waiting and they're waiting. And it's gonna be a minute before it explodes. But as they're waiting, Andrew hears something outside the shack. And immediately it prompts him to just peek out the window just to see what it is, because he knows he's got a little bit of time before this detonates. Then he looks out the window, and specifically he looks down at what's right outside the window, and he can't believe what he's looking at. But it was already too late. So it would turn out Andrew, despite being really excited about being in this new area to get to the silver, that was all true, but also Andrew was a big family man. And it was really hard for him to be so far away from his family. He would get homesick. And so to combat the homesickness for this trip, he had brought with him his beloved dog for company. And this dog was so loyal, it basically followed him everywhere. It kept things light at camp. It was like this great dog. Everybody loved the dog. And on this day, after lighting the fuse and sort of putting the dynamite down, the lit dynamite, they run back over to the shack. And Andrew, he thinks his dog is with him, that the dog has run with them as he has in the past into the shack with him. But when he's crouched down in the shack, he realizes he can't see his dog. The dog's not in the shack. He panics for a second, then he thinks he hears the dog. he looks out the window, and there's his dog. And what has the dog done? It's begun to play its favorite game, fetch. He saw Andrew put that stick of dynamite down after lighting it, and the dog thought that was the beginning of a game of fetch. And so as soon as they had bolted and ran back to the shed, the dog had scooped up one of those lit sticks of dynamite and ran it right back over and dropped it right outside the shack. And the dog's looking up at Andrew. Andrew looks out the window, sees the stick of dynamite, sees the dog. The dog's stoked, turns and runs off, ready for his master to throw this stick to him. But after the dog ran off into the distance, there was nowhere for Andrew or his partners to go. They were trapped. And so the dynamite exploded, ultimately killing Andrew and horribly maiming his partners. And as for the dog, who had playfully run off, totally unharmed. The fourth and final story of today's episode is called Overworked. Around 7 a.m. on August 22, 1913, a 21-year-old businessman named Abraham Wells Boyd Jr. quietly got dressed in his bedroom in Chattanooga, Tennessee. On the bed just behind him was his wife and their 2-year-old son, who were fast asleep. And as Abraham watched them, the two things that he treasured most in the world, he couldn't help but feel unbearably sad, because these days he was never home when his family was actually awake. So Abraham was a part owner of an automobile racetrack that was currently under construction. Now, this construction project was supposed to be a huge step forward in his career, and he was supposed to make a ton of money once the track was open again. But for right now, Abraham felt like this construction project was kind of like a nightmare. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, like in the future, this is going to make me a lot of money, but it was like the project is enormous, it's expensive, and it also means he's not earning money while he's putting money into doing the project. And then on top of all that, he had this huge issue with thieves. Thieves were breaking into the construction site and stealing lumber. And because of these thefts, in addition to all the costs Abraham was incurring just to do the construction, he had also had to hire a full-time security guard. But then last night, the security guard hadn't shown up on time, and so Abraham's the guy, the part owner of this place, who's stepping in as a security guard, staying up all night, doing a job he has no idea how to do, like, pretending to be a security guard. And now he's back home and he's exhausted, and he can't just go to bed, he has to go back out to work. But before he could go to work, he had to take some equipment that he had accidentally taken with him from his shift as the security guard. He had brought something home he wasn't supposed to. He had to go drop that off. Then he had to go back to work. It's like his whole life is a mess right now, and all he wants is this stupid project to be over so he can start earning real money again and can see his family in the daytime hours. But it just felt like that was eons away. So with one more glance over at his wife and kid, who he wished he could just crawl in bed with, Abraham sighed and began gathering up all the things he would need for work that day. His briefcase, some paperwork, and also that equipment that he had to return to the job site, and then also his coat and his hat. And then at some point as he was doing this, Abraham's wife woke up, which Abraham was very happy about. He wanted to talk to her, but he felt bad waking her up, and so she gets up and they talk for a minute, and she helps him finish getting ready. And then after saying bye to her, Abraham went over to the bed to bend over and say goodnight to his son before he left. I mean, in some ways, his son was like the reason he was putting up with all of this. Like, it was to give he and his wife's child the best life he possibly could. And so he goes over and he bends over and he gives the kid a kiss. However, as he bent over to give his son a kiss, there was this sudden, really loud noise coming from somewhere. It was like off to the side of Abraham, or at least it felt like it was over here. And it's so loud that Abraham actually jumped up. It startled him, and he noticed his son, who had been soundly sleeping, also, is now awake and crying, like it's sort of madness in the room. But Abraham has no idea what this noise was or where it came from. Abraham's wife, who had sort of been off to the side of the room at this point, she rushes over because obviously she's heard the sound, she sees the commotion, she's totally bewildered, and she's asking her husband what's going on. And Abraham was about to reply to her that he had no idea, But all of a sudden, he started feeling really dizzy and really hot. He took off his coat and he tried to balance himself against the dresser, but his vision started to get really blurry, and then his legs gave out, and the next thing he knew, he had crumpled to the ground and was lying on his back on the floor. So it would turn out that Abraham filling in for that security guard who missed his shift that night, suddenly Abraham's up all night being the security guard. Even though that specific example only happened one time, it was like across this whole construction project, there were always so many problems that seemed to all fall in Abraham's lap. And so he was constantly overextending himself and pulling overtime shifts and doing things that he wasn't even getting paid to do. It was like his mind and his energy and everything was being spread across every single place in his life. He was just totally, completely burned out. And for the most part, this really only affected Abraham. He just sort of felt really run down all the time. But on the night of the loud sound in the room, well, his overextension of himself, his total exhaustion, had put him and his whole family in danger. So the equipment that Abraham had accidentally taken home with him from having been a fill-in security guard the night before, well, it was a gun, because he had been a security guard, borrowing someone's gun in order to be the security guard. And then he had brought it home with him. And that morning, as Abraham is looking at his wife and son and just sort of run down, like he was especially groggy, and he was not a gun owner himself, so he didn't have really any experience handling a loaded weapon. So even though he had put the gun in its holster, he hadn't actually fastened it in. So it's not locked in there, it's just sitting in the holster. So when he bent down to give his son a kiss, the pistol had slipped out of the holster, hit the floor, and went off, firing a single round into Abraham's chest. Abraham, unfortunately, died of his injuries. On the afternoon of Saturday, September 6, 1997, 19-year-old Brooke Baker typed furiously on a computer in the journalism department at Vincennes University in the small college town of Vincennes, Indiana. Brooke looked at the words on the screen and she felt a rush of excitement. Writing was her favorite pastime. She was a journalist and editor for the university newspaper, but this felt different because Brooke was writing the most important story she'd ever worked on. She finished writing her opening paragraph, read it over a few times, and then exhaled. This was a great start. And she'd secured a major interview in a few days that she knew would make this story the talk of the entire campus when it was done. Brooke loved the idea of having a story that she wrote be talked about by students and faculty. She was only a sophomore, but she already had clear goals for after graduation. She wanted to move to New York and become a writer for the highly prestigious Rolling Stone magazine. But to make that happen, she really needed experience writing major stories like the one she was working on. But in truth, it wasn't the attention or potential accolades that made Brooke want to become a professional journalist. She believed that good reporting and good writing could really make a difference in the world and that it could genuinely help people who needed help. And so that's why she had chosen to write this story in the first place, and why she was now willing to spend part of her weekend alone in the journalism department working on it. Brooke looked down at her watch and saw it was already 3 p.m., later than she realized. So she put her notes in her backpack and got ready to leave. But before she left, she checked her school email. She opened up the first message, and immediately she felt a pit form in her stomach. Then she glanced all around the room, like she thought maybe somebody was secretly watching her, and then she logged out of her email, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and rushed out of the room. Outside, she saw a young man named Steve Hoffman standing by the door with a huge smile on his face. Brooke had long, light brown hair with blue eyes, and today she was wearing jeans and a baggy t-shirt, and Steve thought she was one of the prettiest girls he'd ever met. They'd gone out a couple of times, and Steve hoped they would start going out more often. Brooke smiled back at Steve and apologized for keeping him waiting. He said it wasn't a big deal, that he'd only been there a couple of minutes, but then Steve noticed the worried look on Brooke's face, and he asked if everything was okay. Brooke said, yep, everything's fine. She was just stressed about the story she was working on. And then before Steve could ask any more questions, she took Steve's arm, and they began walking past all the red brick buildings that lined the campus. It was a warm day, almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and a group of students were reclining nearby on the grass, soaking in the sun. The campus was always calm and beautiful around this time of the year, and just walking outside with Steve relaxed Brooke, and so she put the email she had just read out of her mind. A few minutes later, Brooke and Steve turned away from the center of campus onto a small street that had several fast food restaurants on it. Not far away, they could see a bridge that stretched all the way across the Wabash River and led into the state of Illinois on the other side. Brooke and Steve walked into a sandwich place, grabbed some food, and sat down, and before long they were talking about school and also their shared love of movies. And then at some point, as casually as he could, Steve asked if Brooke maybe wanted to come back to his apartment later that night to watch a movie. He said his roommate was going to be out, so they'd have the place to themselves. Brooke told Steve that did sound fun, but she already had plans. So maybe they could hang out and watch movies next weekend. Steve said that would be great, and then they talked some more and finished up their lunch, and then before long, they left the shop and began heading back to campus. And after walking for a little bit, it was time to part ways, and so Brooke thanked Steve again for lunch, and then she walked past the journalism department building and crossed the street to her house. Brooke had chosen this small white wooden house to live in during her sophomore year because it was so close to the university building where she spent most of her time, the journalism building. She also chose it because she could afford to live there by herself. Brooke loved spending time with people, but she also loved having a quiet place to write without any distractions. But tonight was not going to be one of those nights where she wanted total silence and peace because she wasn't writing. Instead, she was going to a party. And so Brooke went inside her house, she dropped her backpack on the floor, and then headed to her bedroom, where she began digging through her closet and laying out clothes to figure out which outfit she was going to wear for the fun that night. After midnight on September 7th, so about 9 hours after Brooke met Steve for lunch, Brooke danced to the music blaring through a small house located just off campus. The party she was at had been raging for a while, and Brooke was having a great time. She'd been really stressed about the story, and this was a good chance for her to blow off some steam. Brooke grinned at the tall young man dancing next to her, and then she wrapped her arms around his neck. His name was Tommy Williams, and he looked at Brooke just the same way that Steve did. He thought she was totally beautiful. And then Tommy asked if she wanted to get out of there with him. Brooke nodded and said, "Yeah, let's go back to my place." And so the two of them said their goodbyes to some friends, and then they left together. The two walked for a few minutes through town and then eventually cut across the campus, which was empty except for a couple of other students wandering home after a night out. Brooke and Tommy had just passed the journalism department and had begun to cross the street to Brooke's house when suddenly bright headlights lit up their faces and they stopped walking. Brooke turned and saw a campus police officer sitting in his vehicle on the street. Brooke grabbed Tommy's hand and told him to walk fast. And so the two crossed the street the rest of the way, and they approached Brooke's house, but before going in, Tommy asked Brooke, "Hey, what's going on? It's just a campus cop. He's most likely just out here looking for drunk students. We're okay. We're not going to get in trouble." But Brooke would say that the guy in the vehicle was not just a campus cop. He was also her landlord, and he totally creeped her out. She told Tommy that she'd caught her landlord a few times watching her through her window. And not long ago, she had gotten out of the shower one time and walked out of the bathroom wearing nothing but a towel, and he was just standing there in her apartment. She had screamed at him and asked, "What are you doing here?" And he said he'd just come to spray the house for bugs. He said it was his right to come in whenever he needed because he was the landlord. Tommy couldn't believe it and said that was totally insane. And he told Brooke that she really should go tell the police, the actual city police, not the campus cops, because this guy sounded legitimately dangerous. Brooke nodded, but said she really just didn't want to talk about it, at least not right then. And so she grabbed her keys out of her purse, but before she could unlock her door, behind them, both she and Tommy heard the sound of another car coming down the road and slowing down basically right behind them, out on the road. But when Brooke and Tommy turned around, the car sped off. Tommy didn't get a good look at the car, and so he just asked Brooke, "Hey, who was that? Who would be pulling up in front of your house and then speeding off in the middle of the night?" Brooke just shook her head. She didn't say anything, but she actually did recognize this second car. It was Steve's. Brooke secretly wondered if maybe Steve had just been waiting by her house on the off chance she might want to go hang out. Or if maybe he had been following her since they ate lunch together that afternoon. And so between the email she got before she left the journalism department, the campus cop parked in front of her house, and now Steve driving and lurking around her house, it had been a really weird day. But still, Brooke was having a good time with Tommy, and she didn't want any of that other stuff to ruin her night. So she opened the door and led Tommy inside. At 9 p.m. that night, so basically 20-ish hours after Brooke and Tommy went inside of Brooke's house,
Brooke's brother knocked on Brooke's front door and called out to his sister. The siblings were supposed to have gotten together that afternoon, but Brooke hadn't been home when he came by. Back in 1997, cell phones were not nearly as prominent as they are now, and Brooke and her brother didn't have them. And so Brooke's brother had tried calling her home, her landline phone, a few times throughout the day, but she hadn't answered. And so now he had just come by her house to make sure she was okay. And so the brother knocked on the door one more time and waited a few minutes, but when he didn't hear anything inside and, the door didn't open, finally he just reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and used the house key that Brooke had given him for her place, and he unlocked the front door. Once he stepped inside, he immediately heard the sound of water running in the bathroom. He figured Brooke must be taking a bath or a shower, so he shouted out to let her know that he was there. But again, nobody responded. Brooke's brother walked down a short hallway towards the bathroom, continuing to call out for his sister, but when he got down the hall, he saw the bathroom door was wide open, and so was the shower curtain, and Brooke wasn't in there. He walked into the bathroom and went straight to the bath, and when he did, he was just confused. The water was running in the bath, and several wet towels were laying in the middle of the tub. He turned off the water and then walked out of the bathroom and headed down the hall towards Brooke's bedroom. He knocked but got no response, and so eventually he opened up the door and walked inside, and right away he turned his head, because the lights were on in the bedroom, and his sister was totally naked, asleep in her bed, and part of her body was exposed. And so Brooke's brother immediately said, I'm so sorry, and he shielded his eyes. And as he was standing there, he didn't hear his sister kind of reacting to his presence, and he knew his sister was actually a really heavy sleeper, and so without looking, he sort of walked over with his head turned away and was starting to cover his sister up with a blanket, to keep her warm. But as he did, he stopped, because something just didn't seem right. He's not looking at his sister, but he can hear her, or more specifically, he can't hear her. He can't hear her breathing. So finally, the brother just turned and looked directly at his sister and also the wall above the headboard, and he just started shaking uncontrollably. And then a moment later, he turned, ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Detective Greg Winkler of the Indiana State Police pulled up to Brooke's white wooden house and parked several feet away from the ambulance that was already out front. The town of Vincennes had a really small police department, and so anytime there was a violent crime in the town, the state police were called. But that really didn't happen very often, and when it did happen, these violent crimes almost never occurred near the college campus, and so Winkler had been very surprised when he got this call. He stepped out of his car and looked up and down the street. It was basically empty, and so Winkler was clearly the first cop to have arrived at the scene. So Winkler walked over and introduced himself, and even though it was pretty dark out in front of the house, Winkler could tell the young man had been sobbing. Winkler eventually asked Brooke's brother if he could please explain what had happened. Brooke's brother told the detective that he and his sister were going to meet up that day, but he hadn't been able to get in touch with her, and so that's why he came by her house. Then he told Winkler about how he let himself in with his own key, and then also what he had seen in the bathroom and, of course, in the bedroom. Detective Winkler thanked him and asked him to please keep waiting outside. Then Winkler walked into the house and found paramedics standing by Brooke's bedroom door. They informed him that the young woman had been dead when they arrived. Winkler nodded and walked into the bedroom. He saw Brooke's body laying on the bed, and right away he lowered his head. He was an experienced homicide detective, but that did not make a scene like this any easier to deal with. Winkler could see immediately that there was blood spatter on the wall behind the bed. He got closer to the body, and he saw multiple wounds on Brooke's neck and chest. There was also blood on the sheets, as if she had suffered wounds on her back as well. Then Winkler noticed the bruising on her inner thighs. The detective would have to wait for the forensics team to arrive, but so far, to him, based on what he was seeing, this looked like a violent murder that had followed a sexual assault. Winkler felt angry. The victim was basically still a kid. One look at the pictures and decorations in her room made that obvious. He walked into the hall, ready to search the rest of the house, but he saw that several local police and state forensics officers had just arrived. One of the Vincennes PD officers was Detective Bob Dunham. The two men greeted each other. They had worked together before, and Winkler turned around and led Dunham into Brooke's room. Dunham looked at the body and the bloodstains on the wall. He had the same thought and felt the same anger as Winkler. Someone most likely had raped this young woman and then viciously killed her. A few minutes later, the detectives left the bedroom and began to search the rest of the house. They started with the bathroom, where those wet towels were laying in the bath, and then after that, they went to the kitchen and they found the sink filled with water with several knives soaking in it. Durham called out to one of the nearby forensics officers, who then quickly came into the kitchen, and they all agreed at least one of those knives in the sink could be a murder weapon, so the forensics officer bagged up all the knives as evidence. After that, the detectives continued their search of the house, and they didn't find any sign of forced entry, and also they found Brooks' purse and some cash just laying out in the open. So from the looks of it, this didn't seem like a crime connected to a robbery. And not long after the detectives had done this search of the house, the forensics team that was also at the house determined that very likely Brooke had been sexually assaulted before being killed, just like the detectives had thought. The forensics officers also pulled DNA samples from Brooke's body, from under her fingernails, and also from the blood on the wall, and they informed the detectives that they would have further information about what happened to her after processing a rape kit. And so to this point, the detectives felt like they sort of had a good amount of information about what very likely happened here, a rape followed by a murder. A horrible thing, but relatively straightforward. And so the detectives believed they were looking for a man, maybe a current or ex-boyfriend who Brooke knew well enough to let into the house, because again, there was no sign of forced entry. Or if it was not a current or ex-boyfriend, they believed they were still looking for a man, but one who just happened to have his own key to this house. Winkler stepped outside and found Brooks' brother standing with a couple of officers. Winkler walked over to him and asked him to give him a more detailed timeline of exactly where he had been that day and also the night before. And Brooks' brother laid it out for him. When he wasn't trying to track down his sister, he had mostly been hanging out with friends. Now, the police would obviously have to follow up with his friends to confirm his alibi, but for now, they took him at face value, and then Winkler asked the brother if he knew of anybody else, friends, family, anybody, who might have a key to his sister's house. Brooks' brother thought about it and then said he was pretty sure he was the only family member who had a key, and then he also said that he did know Brooks' landlord also had a key. He told Winkler the landlord was a campus cop named Mike Nardine, and he knew that his sister could not stand him. Winkler asked why. Was he just like a bad landlord or something? But Brooks' brother said it was way worse than that. He said Mike used to watch his sister through the windows, and one time he had even let himself into the apartment unannounced. At this point, Brooks' brother looked right at Winkler, and the detective looked back and could see how angry the brother was. And so Winkler, sensing there was more here, asked the brother, is there anything else police needed to know about this landlord guy? And Brooks' brother just nodded. He said he was almost positive her landlord, Mike, had offered to let Brooke keep her rent money in exchange for sex. A couple of days later, Detective Winkler and Dunham met with Mike Nardine, the landlord. Brooks' autopsy report suggested that she had been murdered late at night on September 6th or in the early morning hours of September 7th, and the detectives had learned that Mike, the landlord, was working on campus around that exact time and not far from Brooks' house. Mike walked into the small interview room at the Vincennes Police Department and sat down across from the two detectives, and right away the detectives could tell Mike was angry. He made it very clear that he did not understand why they would drag a fellow officer in for this kind of interrogation. But Winkler and Dunham assured Mike they were just trying to get a clear picture of what had happened. This didn't seem to make Mike any happier, but he did answer the detectives' questions about his relationship with Brooke. He told them that he was her landlord and that they would talk from time to time when he was doing work on her house or collecting the rent. When there was a pause in the conversation, Winkler just asked Mike straight out if he had ever spied on Brooke when she was in her house, or if he had ever told Brooke she could exchange sex for rent. Mike glared at the two detectives. He said none of that happened, and if he ever showed up at the house unannounced, it was just to do work that had to get done. That was it. At this, Dunham spoke up, and he told Mike, okay, that all makes sense, and then Dunham asked if Mike would submit to a polygraph test and also provide a DNA sample. After all, if Mike was telling the truth, DNA and a polygraph were the easiest ways to prove that. Mike continued to just glare at the two detectives, but he agreed to both requests. And so Dunham and Winkler excused themselves and walked out of the room, and they quickly arranged for the polygraph test and also sent an officer into the room to swab Mike's cheek for the DNA sample. And a little while later that day, after Mike had taken the polygraph, the detectives thanked him for coming in and told him they would follow up if they needed to. Mike just shook his head and walked out of the room. Once he was gone, Winkler and Dunham joined the polygraph examiner, and the examiner reviewed Mike's test right in front of them, and he told the detectives that the results were inconclusive, which meant there was definitely a chance that Mike had lied on several questions, namely about his relationship with Brooke. Investigators knew it was going to take some time to get the test results back for Mike's DNA sample, as well as the DNA samples that were taken from the crime scene. So while they waited, they spent the next several days interviewing Brooke's friends and family to try to get as much information about the college sophomore as possible. And during these interviews, several people vouched for Brooke's brother's whereabouts on the night and early morning when his sister's murder had supposedly taken place. And so Winkler and Dunham did not consider him to be a primary suspect. But just about all of Brooke's friends told the detectives that there were two guys that Brooke had been seeing, Steve Hoffman and Tommy Williams, and she had hung out with both of them on the day before she was found dead. Winkler and Dunham brought Steve into the station first, and after he sat down, Steve kept fumbling with his hands and running his hands through his hair. It was obvious the kid was nervous. But the detectives didn't think that was very suspicious because, after all, he was young and he had just been thrown right into the middle of a murder investigation. Winkler spoke calmly to Steve. He said Steve was not in any trouble, but they needed him to be completely honest with them, even if whatever he had to say might be embarrassing or might make him feel like he was betraying Brooke's trust. Steve nodded and said he would tell them whatever they needed to know. So Winkler started by asking how long Steve and Brooke had been together. But right away, Steve said he and Brooke weren't really dating, they were just friends with benefits. They had started hanging out with each other recently, and they had had sex a few times, but Steve said he really liked Brooke, and he really hoped that their relationship would become more serious over time. Then Dunham asked point blank if Steve had slept with Brooke that past weekend, but Steve said no, he hadn't. He said he met Brooke for lunch on Saturday and asked if she wanted to meet up later that night at his place, but she said she already had plans. After a pause, Dunham leaned in and asked Steve if his lunch date with Brooke was actually the last time he had seen Brooke. And at this question, Steve sort of froze and began to stammer like he couldn't make a sentence, but then he finally said, after their lunch, he had just gone back to his apartment and his roommate, Brian Jones, could vouch for him. Dunham nodded and asked if he and his roommate Brian were both at the apartment the whole day. But Steve said that Brian had gone out later that night, so Steve at one point was at the apartment just by himself. And at this point, Dunham just said, okay, take a deep breath, and I want you to answer the original question. Was lunch the last time you saw Brooke? At this, Steve shook his head, and his face turned bright red like he was totally embarrassed. And he told the detectives that on the night after he and Brooke had gotten lunch together, he had driven to her house and actually parked his car nearby. He knew she had gone out that night, but he thought maybe when she got home, she might want to hang out with him. But around maybe 1 a.m. or so, he saw Brooke walk up to her door with another guy. And when he saw this, he felt this immediate rush of jealousy and anger, and for a second he drove right up in front of her house and then sped off down the street. Dunham and Winkler looked at each other as if they kind of knew that this was a big moment in the interview. And then Winkler turned back towards Steve and leaned in, and he asked if Steve had been angry enough about seeing this other guy to maybe go back to Brooke's house later to confront Brooke about the other guy. Maybe they got into a fight. Maybe things got out of control. At this point, Steve began to get visibly upset. He said he never went back to the house, he really liked Brooke, and he would never hurt her. He had just been stupid and jealous, and that was really it. The detectives let Steve collect himself, and then after a few moments, Dunham asked him if he would provide a DNA sample. And at this, Steve did not hesitate. He said he would do whatever they needed if it would help them find Brooke's killer. Later that week, Winkler and Dunham met with Tommy, the other guy that Brooke was seeing before she was killed, and the interview went pretty much the same way the interview with Steve had gone. Tommy said he and Brooke periodically went out together, and yes, they had slept with each other a few times, but they were not in a serious relationship. Tommy said he and Brooke had been at a party together that Saturday night, then they had gone to her house and they had had sex. He said he left not long afterwards, maybe sometime around 1:30 in the morning, and then he walked around campus for a while and eventually ended up going to his friend's apartment and crashing on his couch. Now, this part of Tommy's story did jump out at the detectives. Tommy could be telling the truth here, but there was a gap of time when nobody would have seen him, so he had no alibi. and that was more than enough time for him to murder Brooke, dump those towels in the bath, put the murder weapon in the sink, clean himself up, and then head to his friend's place. And so the detectives asked Tommy to submit a DNA sample, and he said he would. And then after Tommy had given that sample, the detectives told him that he could go, but that he needed to stay in town. A few weeks into the investigation, the DNA test results from the crime scene and also the results from the rape kit came in, and both provided a DNA sample that the crime lab believed belonged to Brooke's killer. But soon after that, DNA test results came in for Brooke's landlord Mike and from the two guys Brooke had been seeing, Steve and Tommy, but none of their DNA was a clear match to the samples taken from Brooke's body and the crime scene. Now, this did not necessarily mean that, now Mike, Steve, and Tommy are all innocent, but it did mean that police did not have the kind of scientific evidence that would hold up in court. So investigators didn't feel like they had enough to arrest any of their top 3 suspects. And these test results felt like a major setback for Winkler and Dunham. They had become convinced that one of the DNA samples they had secured would match the killer's. And so now they had to totally refocus their investigation and start looking for potential leads that maybe they had overlooked. And as is often the case when a terrible crime takes place in a small community, police began getting lots of pressure from local media, city leaders, and Brooke's friends and family to solve this case quickly. At around this time, Winkler and Dunham made their way across the university campus towards the journalism department. It was hard for them to describe, but even the campus felt like it was full of tension from this case. Like nobody could relax because they feared they might be the next victim because whoever did this had not been caught yet. The detectives entered the journalism department, walked down a long hallway lit with bright fluorescent lights, and found their way to a small office that was cluttered with books. In the office was one of Brooke's journalism professors, who also served as Brooke's advisor, and she welcomed Winkler and Dunham, and then she sat down at her desk. The detectives thanked her for meeting with them, and then Winkler got right into it. He asked her if she knew of any rivalries between Brooke and maybe other journalism students. He told the professor that at this point, the police were looking for anything that might point them in the right direction. Brooke's professor said nothing like that was going on, at least nothing that she was aware of. She said Brooke was very friendly and outgoing and was able to get along with pretty much everyone. She was even one of those rare students who didn't fall into a specific clique and who had friends from all different groups on campus. But then the professor stopped and lowered her voice, and with a very serious look, she told the detectives that actually there might be one group of students that the police should look into. The professor said right before Brooke was killed, she had been working on a story that was going to make a lot of people angry. She was covering an alleged rape that had taken place during a frat party right out on the steps in the front of the frat house. Brooke was set to interview the young woman who was accusing the fraternity brothers, but Brooke had died just days before that interview was going to happen. At this, Winkler and Dunham shot each other a look. This was not anything that Brooke's friends had mentioned. So the detectives got as much information about the story and the fraternity as they could. Then they thanked the professor again, left the campus, and then arranged to search Brooke's phone records and emails. And as they were conducting this search, they quickly discovered Brooke had been receiving threatening emails from members of this fraternity the entire time she'd been working on the story. And one of those emails simply read, "Write the story, and you will die." This new lead initially gave a huge jolt to the investigation. Over the next few weeks, police tracked down the members of the fraternity who were directly connected to the story Brooke had been writing, and they secured DNA samples from 10 of these young men, and they interviewed a number of students who had actually been at the frat party in question. However, when the DNA test results came back from the frat brothers, none of them matched the killer's DNA sample. This left Detectives Winkler and Dunham almost at a complete loss. Lead after lead had fallen apart, and it was starting to look like maybe Brooke's killer just had no clear connection to her at all. Over the next several months, the detectives continued to search for new evidence and new leads, but nothing of use surfaced. And eventually, the Vincennes Police Department determined that they didn't have the resources to continue their full-time investigation. So Detective Dunham was pulled away to work on other cases. And then finally, after a year had gone by and still there was no more traction on the case, the Indiana State Police determined that Brooke's murder was now officially a cold case. On July 5th, 1999, almost 2 years after Brooke's murder, Detective Winkler sat at his desk, looking over cases that had come in during the July 4th holiday. The phone rang and Winkler answered. Detective Dunham was on the other line, and he was talking so fast, Winkler almost couldn't understand him. But Dunham eventually slowed down and said he was at an apartment in town following up on a missing persons call, and Winkler needed to get there right now. And so Winkler, who trusted Dunham, he hung up, got in his car, and sped across town. Winkler found Dunham waiting for him outside the apartment complex, and then as soon as Winkler got out, Dunham quickly led him into the apartment and right to the bathroom. And Winkler almost could not believe what he was seeing. A pile of wet towels were right there in the middle of the tub, and Dunham told Winkler the bathwater had been running when police arrived at the scene. Then Dunham led Winkler to the kitchen, and the sink was filled with water, and knives were soaking in it. Next, they went to the bedroom, and Dunham showed Winkler the bloodstains on the wall. The crime scene looked almost identical to the scene at Brooks' house, except for one major difference. The Vincennes University sophomore who lived there, Erica Norman, was nowhere to be found. Investigators thought there was still a chance Erica was alive, and so they quickly coordinated with local and state police right across the Wabash River in Illinois, and they launched a two-state search for her. But 15 days later, on July 20th, 1999, police would find Erica, but she was deceased. Her body was found abandoned in a field on the Illinois side of the river. Back in Indiana, Winkler and Dunham met with several of Erica's friends, and one of them told the detectives that the night Erica had gone missing, she had gone home to watch movies with a guy she knew from work. And when Erica's friend told them who this guy was, the detectives felt a rush of adrenaline, but they also felt a huge sense of regret. They recognized the name. And so now they were nearly certain who had killed both Erica Norman and Brooke Baker. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted over a 2-year period, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Brooke Baker in the early morning hours of September 7th, 1997. The killer sat on the couch next to Brooke. The pair was watching TV, but at some point, Brooke said she was tired and just wanted to go to bed. However, as Brooke began to get up to leave, the killer turned and grabbed her by the arm and pulled her in to kiss her. Brooke shied away and said she didn't want to do that, but the killer just jumped on top of her and then tried to take her clothes off. Immediately, Brooke tried to fight him off, and she slashed the killer's face with her fingernails, and the killer was so stunned by it, he kind of sat up for a second, at which point Brooke managed to jump up from underneath him off the couch, and she ran down the hall. But the killer just ran right after her. He caught up to her, grabbed her from behind, and shoved her into the nearest bedroom. He forced Brooke onto the bed, ripped off her clothes, and then sexually assaulted her. The whole time, Brooke tried to fight back, but she couldn't break free. And then at some point, the killer, who was on top of her, grabbed her by the throat and started choking her. Brooke coughed and wheezed and tried to get air, but the killer kept choking her tighter and tighter until Brooke began to lose consciousness. But the killer let go and climbed off the bed. Brooke was still breathing, but she could barely move. And so the killer ran out of the room, went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife in the sink, and then ran back to the bedroom. Brooke saw her killer rushing back into the room with the knife, and so she used the little strength she had left to turn over on her side and try to pull herself up and out of the bed, but the killer just leapt on top of her again, and he slammed the knife over and over and over again into Brooke's back, stabbing her a total of 11 times. As the killer did this, blood sprayed on the wall, the sheets, and the killer's hands and clothes, and when the killer was done, they climbed off of Brooke and rolled her onto her back. They weren't sure, but they thought Brooke was still breathing. So they raised the knife and stabbed her in the chest. Now, the killer was sure she was dead. The killer climbed off the bed and stood in the bedroom, breathing heavily and trying to collect their thoughts. Finally, they walked out and went to the bathroom. They put the knife down, grabbed a few towels, and tried to wipe the blood off themselves. Then they threw the towels into the tub and turned on the water. Then they picked up the murder weapon, the knife, and went to the kitchen. They filled the sink up with water and then dropped the knife in it to soak. Then the killer walked through the apartment, turned off the TV, then walked to the front door. They opened it up and locked the handle from the inside, and then poked their head out, kind of scanning the street. And when everything looked clear, the killer casually stepped outside, closing the now locked door behind them, and then they took off running across campus back to their apartment. It would turn out Brooke had known her killer well enough to let them into her house, just as investigators had suspected. But the killer was not one of the young men Brooke was seeing. It was actually one of their roommates. At the time of Brooke's murder, Brian Jones had lived with Steve, the guy who met Brooke for lunch and hoped to, at some point, have a more serious relationship with her. And so Brian had met Brooke a few times when she had come by the apartment to see Steve, and, they had gotten along well because Brooke got along with basically everybody. But Brooke had no idea that in those sparse interactions she had with him, Brian had developed an obsession with her. And so on the night that Brooke would be murdered, Brian went out and just kept thinking about her. And when he showed up at her house later that night, he was determined to have sex with her, whether she wanted to or not. And when Brooke denied him, Brian raped and then murdered her. Brian's name had come up in Brooke's murder investigation, but only in passing. And after 2 years went by, it looked like he would get away with his horrific crime. But then Brian had become obsessed with Erica Norman, another Vincennes University sophomore who had light brown hair and light eyes. Brian knew Erica from work, and just like he had done with Brooke, he decided he was going to have sex with her no matter what. And on that night in July of 1999, he went to Erica's place to watch movies, but then just assaulted and murdered her almost identically to how he had done it 2 years earlier at Brooke's house. In fact, putting the towels in the bath and soaking the knife in the sink was something Brian had seen in a movie and imitated. But this time with Erica, he moved her body to a field across the border in Illinois, thinking that would help distance himself from the crime. But one of Erica's friends knew that Brian had gone to Erica's house on the night she disappeared. And so when Detectives Winkler and Dunham tracked Brian down, they convinced him to provide a DNA sample, and when the results came back, investigators finally got their match to Brooke's killer's DNA. Brian was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years without chance for parole. To honor Brooke's love of writing and her belief that journalists could change the world, the Indiana Collegiate Press Association established the Brooke Baker Indiana Collegiate Journalist of the Year Award, and it continues to inspire young journalists to use their work to help others.
Early on the morning of January 12, 1765, a 12-year-old boy named Jacques Portufis sat up suddenly in his bed, breathing hard. The room was pitch black that he was in, but he could feel he was sweating and his heart was racing, and he tried to shake his head to kind of wipe the nightmare he had just had from his mind, but he just couldn't do it. All he could think about was how in this nightmare, something had been chasing him, and he had been running for his life, and he was trying to get away, but whatever this thing was, this horrible beast that was following him, it just kept getting closer and closer and closer until it finally got him, and that's what woke him up. Jacques reached up and touched his face, and he realized he was crying, and he quickly wiped the tears away because he didn't want any of his brothers or sisters to see that he was crying. Jacques was the oldest of 8 kids in his family, and all of them slept in the same small room on straw-filled mattresses inside of their family's little cottage in the southern French province of Gévaudan. And so, Jacques, he's looking around the bedroom to make sure none of his siblings had woken up and seen him in this state, and he was relieved to see that they were all still fast asleep. Everybody made fun of Jacques for being a scaredy cat, for being a coward. And to Jacques, this really hurt his feelings because on some level, he knew it was kind of true. In fact, just a couple of months earlier, he had lost in a physical fight with a much younger boy, and afterwards, Jacques had cried, and the whole town had seen this happen, and so afterward, all the kids began calling Jacques the wet chicken, and even Jacques' brothers and sisters began joining in and calling him the wet chicken, and really making him feel totally ashamed. And it wasn't like the adults in this village were stepping up and protecting Jacques, because to them, Jacques was kind of like a liability. In this part of France, the winters were brutal. People died all the time in this village from the weather. And then the summers brought all these outbreaks of disease, which wiped out even more people in this village. And so by and large, where Jacques lived, it was kind of like the survival of the fittest. And many kids didn't live that long unless they were really hardy and tough, like their parents who had managed to survive for that long. But Jacques was just not like that. He was very gentle and peaceful, yet somehow he had survived.
And Jacques really was not trying to become this kind of macho guy. Instead, he really wanted to be a priest, like his uncle. But his uncle lived far away, and so it was tough to see his uncle all that often, to learn about, how to become a priest. But anytime Jacques did get a chance to actually see his uncle, he would have a chance to read all these books and study alongside his uncle. And so for a little while, it was like Jacques was transported away from the hardships of his village to the life that in many ways he wished he had. A quiet, peaceful, very studious life. But deep down, Jacques felt like there was no chance he would ever actually escape this little village where he effectively was an outcast. Even though the sun had not risen yet, Jacques just sat on his bed and couldn't fall asleep again after waking up from this nightmare. And so just sitting there in the dark and the quiet, Jacques began to think about what he had to do later that day when the sun did come up. And like usual, Jacques started to feel afraid. And so Jacques eventually just laid down with his eyes open, and he laid there until dawn when one of his younger brothers, named Jean, who was 8 years old, rolled over and pushed him and said, "Hey, wet chicken, it's time to get up. It's our day with the sheep. Let's go." Jacques scowled at his younger brother and shoved him back, but not that hard, because Jacques never really shoved anybody that hard, no matter what they did to him. And then both boys hopped out of their bed, they wolfed down some bread and cheese, and then headed out the door. As soon as they were outside, Jacques noticed that the village was much quieter than it normally was. But then again, these days, villagers did not leave their homes unless they absolutely had to. And so Jacques and Jean made their way away from their cottage down the dirt road to the pen where their family kept all of their sheep. And the boys opened up the gate and then used their staffs to kind of corral the sheep out of the gate back onto the road. And as the sheep kind of bleated and baaed and bumped into each other, the boys worked hard to kind of organize them on the road. And then once the sheep understood which direction they were going, towards the forest, a very familiar walk for the sheep, they kind of fell into line and just began walking very casually, like they knew exactly where to go. And once the sheep had fallen into this kind of routine rhythm, Jacques and Jean fell in behind them and just walked quietly after them. And as the boys walked, they both constantly kept looking left and right and ahead of the sheep and behind them, constantly scanning for danger, because they knew something was out here. For months now, children all across this province in France, Gévaudan, had been going missing. They'd go off into fields or pastures, like when they're moving their family's livestock around, and the kids would just vanish. And then sometimes, if they were found again, they'd be found totally mutilated far from where they should have been. The attacks on these kids across Gévaudan had begun a year earlier on June 30th, 1764. On that day, a 14-year-old girl, who actually was the older sister of one of Jacques' friends, had disappeared and then been found again later that day, partially eaten in a field near her home after she had not come home with the family's cattle. Now, of course, this was very tragic, but to this point, there had not been any other attacks, so there was no pattern here, and so the assumption was she must have been attacked by a wolf, which did happen, and often two children, because kids at this time in France were often in charge of tending to their family's grazing animals, the way Jacques and Jean were going out with their sheep. These kids were small, they couldn't really defend themselves, and if a wolf set onto them, there was very little they could do. But 5 weeks after this 14-year-old girl was found dead and mutilated in the field, 2 more teenagers were also found mutilated and dead in a field. And really, this was only the beginning. As summer turned to fall that year, more and more kids went missing and then turned up dead in fields, partially mutilated. And the more these attacks happened across southern France, the more people thought to themselves, this can't be a wolf. Number one, wolves don't go on extended human killing sprees. That's just not a thing. And number two, if it was a wolf, they would be eating more of their victims. They wouldn't just rip their body to shreds and then leave them. They would eat the meat. And so by this early January day in 1765, as Jacques and Jean were setting out for the day with their family's sheep, the death toll from whatever was killing these kids was now well into the dozens. People in France had begun calling whatever was killing these children the Beast of Gévaudan, and stories about this creature began popping up in newspapers all over France. People all across southern France began forming these huge hunting parties to go out into the forests and the wilds of Gévaudan to find this creature and kill it, but they would always come back empty-handed. And then every now and again, a hunter would be out and they would see a huge wolf and they would kill it and they would declare that they had found and killed the beast of Gévaudan. But the attacks on these kids all across this province just continued. So obviously that wolf was not it. And so as these attacks continued, all the fairs and festivals that normally would pop up all year long, all across southern France, those all stopped because people were afraid to go out in fear of this creature. And then of course, in villages like Jacques' village, people really just stopped going out unless they had to, again, because of the beast of Gévaudan. But Jacques and Jean's family relied on their livestock and they needed their sheep to go out and graze. And so on this day in January, Jacques and Jean had to go out because their sheep had to graze. Their family relied on the sheep, livestock was their livelihood, and so this was a mandatory thing. As Jacques and Jean continued walking behind their herd of sheep down this dirt road towards the forest, the two boys eventually came to a stop and just turned around and looked back at their village, and they saw walking on the road towards them were 5 more kids, along with 2 additional herds of sheep that these 5 kids were in charge of. Ever since the beast of Gévaudan had become a thing, Jacques and Jean had begun tending their sheep along with these 5 kids and their sheep. They figured the bigger their group was, the safer they were from this creature. As the 5 kids got closer to Jacques and Jean, Jacques realized that one of the kids that was with them this day was a tall, thin redhead. It was the same younger boy who had recently beaten Jacques up in front of the village, and he had cried and everyone had made fun of him. And so Jacques sees this kid coming and immediately he can feel his face burning with embarrassment. And then the boy, he sees Jacques and he immediately smirks and begins flapping his arms like chicken wings. But once these 5 kids and their sheep joined Jacques and Jean and their sheep, they all kind of just went quiet because none of them wanted to be out there. They were all scared of the beast of Gévaudan, and the only reason they were together was, again, to be safe from this creature that was killing kids left and right. And so, in relative silence, all of the kids and their sheep just slowly walked together down this dirt path, and eventually they made it into the big forest, where just beyond the forest was the pasture where these sheep would graze. And as the group actually entered into the trees and it became dark and more quiet and kind of eerie, Jean actually tugged on Jacques' shoulder and said, "Will you please tell a story?" Because Jean was scared too. The kids were all scared, and they figured, if Jacques just told a story, it would take their mind off of how tense this moment was. And when Jacques heard this request, he actually smiled because this was something he loved to do. He was a great storyteller. It was like his one strength. When Jean had asked for the story, the kids and the sheep had actually made it to really the end of the forest path. And so by the time Jacques was about to start his story, all the sheep had made their way out of the forest onto this big open pasture right in the middle of the forest. And so as the sheep just kind of filtered out into this open area, Jacques stopped and all the kids kind of came up right behind him, and Jacques started his story by pointing across the pasture to this bog that was right at the base of this big hill, and he said, "Do you see those big rocks in that bog over there? Well, you see the biggest rock? Well, that's not really a rock. It's actually a doorway, and if you move the rock underneath it, there's a portal to another world." And so as Jacques began telling this very creative story about this kingdom that existed underneath the bog, he sat down against a rock, kind of facing out towards the sheep, and all the other kids kind of filed in around him, taking seats, with Jean, his brother, sitting right behind him to his right. And Jacques, he was just really into the story to the point where he kind of forgot about what was happening with the sheep, and he wasn't scanning around for danger, and neither were any of the kids, including the redhead who had beaten Jacques up. He wanted to act like he wasn't into his story, but in reality, he totally was, and he was just as interested in what was going on with the magical kingdom below this rock. And finally, when Jacques got to the end of his story, where this evil giant that had been tormenting the kingdom under the bog had been tricked by an orphan to try to go through this magical portal into their world, and the giant had gotten stuck in the doorway because he was so big, and he never tormented the kingdom again, and they lived happily ever after. When Jacques got to that point in the story and all the kids are totally locked in and not paying attention to anything else, 2 things happened in rapid succession. The first was, even though Jacques is telling the story and focusing on that, in the back of his mind, he registers hearing the sound of twigs breaking somewhere right behind him, almost like the sound of someone or something moving along the forest floor. And the second thing that happened was the red-headed kid who had beaten up Jacques, without saying a word, just stood up and and began sprinting towards the pasture. And for a moment, Jacques thought this kid, who was kind of like a bully, was doing this on purpose, to be rude to Jacques, to kind of run away at the climax of the story like he didn't care about it. But then Jacques realized that he smelled something terrible behind him. But when Jacques turned around to see what was making this smell, he saw that his brother, Jean, who had been sitting right behind him to his right, was now gone, and where he had been sitting was just his staff laying on the ground. And for a second, Jacques just couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. He didn't understand how his brother could have gotten away from him without him noticing. But before Jacques could do anything, all the kids around him that were still there began screaming and pointing up towards this hill that was right behind them. And so Jacques turned around, and to his horror, he saw there was this huge 12-foot tall creature that was covered in fur. It looked like an oversized wolf, but it was standing on two legs, and its bones seemed like they were too big for its own skin, and it made it seem very angular and jagged. And as it kind of loped grotesquely up the hillside, Jacques realized it was carrying in its front arm Jean, who was screaming and kicking but could not get away from this creature. Jacques understood that this was the beast of Gévaudan, and it was going to go kill his brother. And immediately Jacques is thinking, you gotta run away, get to safety, get out of here. And all the kids around him, that's what they did. They took off running towards the pasture. They didn't care about Jean, they only cared about themselves. And so Jacques, he knows he needs to get away, save himself, but his legs just will not move. He is rooted to the spot because something inside of him told him he has to save his brother. It doesn't matter if everyone thinks he's a coward. That's his brother. He needs to do something. And so Jacques, he turns to the kids who are running away from him, and he screams at them to stop, come back. And the kids were so surprised to hear this strong, authoritative voice coming out of the wet chicken that they did stop and turned around to see what he wanted. And he said, get over here. I have a plan. And so the kids, with the exception of the redhead who had run off by himself, they came back to Jacques, and Jacques began telling them his plan to save Jean. And the kids, again, were so taken with how Jacques was really owning this moment and being a leader that they all said, okay, let's do this. And so after this very quick planning meeting, all the kids turned and began running up the hillside towards the beast of Gévaudan, with Jacques in the front with his staff out. And the kids gained on the beast really quickly, and the creature clearly noticed and kept turning around and kept looking at these kids getting closer and closer, but the beast did not seem interested in any of them. It just wanted Jean. And in fact, it moved Jean from its arm up into its mouth, and then the creature began kind of using the trees to pull itself faster and faster away from the kids. But Jacques, he just kept going faster and faster and pushing himself to get closer and closer. And as he did, it motivated the other kids to follow along and push it and gain on this creature. And finally, they got close enough to this beast that Jacques yelled out to the kids, now! And they all fanned out around it and began smashing this beast with their staffs they used to shepherd their livestock. Now, none of their blows to this creature were doing any real damage, and the creature did not really seem fazed that the kids were now attacking it, but they were kind of able, with their strikes to this creature, to direct it and get it to kind of turn in the direction that Jacques had told them to make the creature go. And so the kids continued to beat and poke and corral this creature, and every time they'd hit it, the beast would kind of flail out with one of its arms, but it never really did anything because, again, it's really focused, obviously, on taking Jean. But eventually, Jacques' plan worked. He had corralled the creature to the top of the hillside, right over where that bog was, where those rocks in the middle were part of the story that Jacques had told about how there was this portal to another world. And once this creature was positioned where Jacques wanted it, he again yelled to the kids to do the next phase of their plan. And all the kids kind of fanned out to the top of the hill, and with their staffs, they beat and poked this creature down the hill into the bog. And as they did this, Jacques kept looking to see if Jean was alive, because earlier he had been screaming and kicking, but now there was blood all over his brother, and he was limp in the creature's mouth, and he wasn't making any sound. But Jacques didn't care. He wanted to get his brother back.
dead or alive. And so finally, Jacques stepped forward from the group, and he wound up and he smashed the beast as hard as he could, hard enough that the beast actually kind of stumbled forward into the actual marshy bog. And what Jacques knew about this bog and why he had come up with that particular story about there being a gateway to another world is weeks earlier, he had actually accidentally stepped into this bog and saw it was really deep. And he had been lucky enough that he had grabbed a rock and kind of pulled himself out, because if he hadn't, the bog kind of functioned like quicksand. You could get stuck in the bog and never get out again. And this is what happened to the beast of Gévaudan. It went feet first into the one spot of the bog that Jacques had had all the kids corral it to, that was the deepest and most dangerous part. And as soon as the beast stepped into it, it sunk down to its waist. And immediately the beast reached out with its huge muscular arms and tried to pull itself out of the bog, but it couldn't. It was stuck. And so in its panic, it let go of Jean from its mouth, and it actually turned around and it looked at Jacques and the other kids. And when it did, Jacques almost lost his nerve, because when he saw this thing face to face up close, he saw this was not a wolf's face. This was almost like a human face. Its eyes were making distinct eye contact with Jacques, and it was furious. It was like the beast understood that Jacques had just trapped it. He had tricked the beast into walking into this bog, and it wanted to kill Jacques. And for a moment, Jacques was totally entranced by this creature's eyes. It just struck him that this looks human. It looks intelligent. What is this thing? And while Jacques was kind of in this daze, the creature reached forward and slashed his stomach wide open, and Jacques fell backwards on the ground, but luckily he was far enough away from the beast that he couldn't be pulled back in. And in this kind of frantic moment, one of the other kids saw an opportunity and ran forward, grabbed Jean, who was laying on the surface of the bog, and he pulled him away from the beast. And the beast whipped around. He tried to grab Jean, but he couldn't. And so all of a sudden, all these kids were safely away from the beast of Gévaudan, who was totally trapped. And so at this point, the other kids who were not hurt, they scooped up Jacques and they scooped up Jean, and they began running away from the bog across the pasture back towards the village, leaving the beast where it was. And as they ran, they heard it bellowing out and roaring and trying to pull itself out, but it still just remained in the bog. And finally, as they got back to that dirt path that led back to the village, they saw there was a group of armed villagers running towards them, because it would turn out the redhead who had ran off, he had told the village, and they were coming out to help the kids. And so as the armed villagers met with the kids, they told them where the beast was, stuck in that bog, and the villagers took off to go kill the beast. And then the kids, along with Jacques and Jean, they went into the village. They were put into a home and put on beds, by which point the village doctor had come over and began treating both of them. Jean was alive, but just barely. He had lost a lot of blood, and the beast had grabbed onto his scalp and really crushed his skull, but he would ultimately survive. As for Jacques, it was a very painful wound that he had sustained on his stomach, but none of his internal organs had been damaged, and so he would also survive as well. As for the armed villagers, even though they very quickly got out to that bog where the beast was, when they got there, the beast was gone. And the beast of Gévaudan would continue to kill people for another 2 years, until June 19th, 1767, when a hunter happened to encounter it in the middle of a forest, and he shot and killed it. And by that point, over 100 people had been murdered by this creature. The hunter would drag the carcass of the beast back into his village, and a doctor would perform an autopsy, but the doctor was unable to identify what kind of animal it was. It did kind of look like a wolf, a really huge wolf, but its body was just so misshapen and its bones were too big, and it clearly walked on 2 legs, not on all 4s, and so there was never any definitive information about what this even was and how this even happened. But when they opened up its stomach, they did find human body parts. Jacques was one of the only people to have ever survived an encounter with the beast of Gévaudan. And so he was celebrated all across France, and he quickly went from being the wet chicken to the little hero, and his story would reach as far away as Boston, Massachusetts. And in fact, Jacques' story was so well publicized that it eventually reached King Louis XV, and he was so moved by it that he invited Jacques to come meet him, and after meeting Jacques, he loved him and offered to pay for his entire education. And so Jacques would get to finally leave this little village where he never quite fit in, and he would move to northern France and enroll in a prestigious school there, and he would spend his days reading and writing just like he had always hoped for.
Around 1 p.m. on August 6, 2011, a 32-year-old seafood vendor named Carla Flores stood in the entryway of her home, balancing a tray of shrimp in one hand and waving goodbye to her 3 kids with the other. She told her kids she'd be right back, and then she stepped out the front door onto the streets of Culiacan, which is a major city in northwestern Mexico. Carla was going to deliver this tray of shrimp to one of her regular customers. She walked down an alleyway and then onto a main road, and then eventually into a neighborhood with a whole bunch of brightly colored houses. She went up to one of them and knocked on the door. A man answered, and Carla handed him the tray of shrimp. He took the shrimp, gave her a handful of cash. She thanked him and turned and headed back down towards the street. And Carla had made it all the way back to the alleyway right near her house when suddenly she heard this loud sound, and then before she could figure out what it was, this small, hard object smashed into her right cheek, and it hit her so hard she fell onto the pavement. And so instinctively, Carla reached up and she touched her cheek, and she felt a warm, wet liquid. She looked at her hand, and it was covered in blood. Carla tried to get up, but her ears were ringing and she felt dizzy, and then suddenly, everything went black. 20 minutes later, a receptionist at Culiacan General Hospital watched as a man carried a bloody, unconscious woman into the emergency room. He laid her down on a bench in the waiting area, and then he just turned around and began walking back out again. The receptionist jumped up and chased after this guy, demanding to know what was going on with this woman. Who is she? What happened to her? What are you doing? But the guy just said, look, I was driving down the road and I saw this woman bloody in the streets, and so I brought her here. I promise you, that's all I know. And then he turned and kept on walking, and the receptionist went back inside to check on the woman. The receptionist looked down at the woman. She was unconscious, her mouth was hanging open, and the entire right side of her face was totally mangled. And then embedded in this mess on the right side of her cheek, basically in her head, was this weird dark-colored object, but she couldn't tell what it was, and she didn't have time to stand around trying to find out. So she called for help, and a couple of nurses came running out of the emergency room, and together they lifted this woman up, put her on a gurney, and wheeled her back to see a doctor. A few moments later, Dr. Gustavo Mesa walked into Carla's hospital room. He'd been briefed on her condition, but when he went inside, she was no longer unconscious. Now her eyes were wide open, and she looked totally confused. Dr. Mesa could tell Carla was having trouble breathing, and she couldn't close her mouth. But then, Carla began making this grunting sound. And at first, the doctor couldn't understand what she was saying, but then it became clear she was saying, rock, rock, rock. Dr. Mesa's first thought was, oh, she's telling me she was hit by a rock. That's what's caused her injury. And so Dr. Mesa leaned in and looked at her wound, and he caught a glimpse of what looked like a dark-colored stone buried inside of her cheek. Dr. Mesa thought, wow, she must have been hit so hard by this rock, this stone, for it to get buried that far inside of her face. He promised Carla he would get it out, but first he told her she would have to undergo an x-ray to really figure out where it was in her skull and how exactly they'd be able to get it out. A few minutes later, Dr. Mesa stood in the radiology department looking over Carla's x-ray images, and it was immediately clear to him and all the other medical staff that what was in Carla's cheek was not a rock, because the object was shaped like an oval, it had round edges, and it was perfectly symmetrical. To Dr. Mesa, it just seemed far too uniform to be a rock. But he didn't have a better guess for what it was. All he could tell from the x-ray was this object had broken Carla's upper and lower jaw and shattered several of her teeth, and now this object was stuck between her broken jawbones. Dr. Mesa knew it was going to take surgery to get this thing out, but he needed more information before he felt confident operating. So he ordered a CAT scan of Carla's head to give him a more detailed picture of this object. And when the results came in and Dr. Mesa looked at the image, his face went pale. He couldn't believe what he was looking at, but the proof was right there in front of him, and he knew he would have to do something, and fast. So Dr. Mesa ran to the nearest nurse's station and told the nurse to evacuate everybody from the emergency room. Then he grabbed the hospital phone and he dialed a military official. Less than an hour later, Carla was no longer in the hospital. She was now out in the middle of a grassy field, laying on her back, absolutely terrified. An anesthesiologist walked up to her and injected a local anesthetic into her cheek. And suddenly, the agonizing pain that Carla had felt ever since waking up in the hospital was now gone. But her absolute terror was not. Carla knew there were 2 doctors and a nurse standing by to perform an operation on her, but also there were 2 army soldiers just a few feet away from her, staring at her. Carla saw a doctor start to bring a scalpel toward her face, and she had to close her eyes to keep from flinching. She heard the soldiers giving directions and the clinking of surgical instruments. And all the while, Carla kept her eyes shut tight and just tried to pretend none of this was even happening. And after what felt like a lifetime, Carla felt a shift inside of her face, and it was the doctors and nurses pulling this object out of her cheek. Carla opened her eyes, and right above her head, she saw the doctor holding the bloody thing they had just removed from her face. It was a live grenade. That's why she was being operated on, not in the hospital, but out in this open field, because if it did go off mid-operation, it would at least limit casualties. And that's also why the military was called in to tell the medical staff how to handle this live piece of ordnance in the middle of the operation. After the grenade was safely removed from Carla's face, it was disposed of by the army soldiers. It's believed that the grenade that hit Carla was fired out of a grenade launcher. That would explain the loud sound she heard in the alleyway before it hit her in the face. Luckily though, the grenade's fuse that should have ignited and caused it to explode didn't work. So even though it absolutely was a live grenade, it didn't explode, and so it didn't kill her. It's unknown who shot the grenade, why they shot it, or whether Carla was the intended target or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carla would ultimately lose half her teeth, she would undergo multiple reconstructive surgeries, and she would be left with a huge scar on her right cheek. But she said she was just happy to be alive, and she was forever grateful to the stranger who brought her to the hospital, and to the medical team and the army soldiers who risked their lives to save her. One morning in the spring of 1982, a mother rushed to the reception desk at the Royal London Hospital in England, cradling her 6-week-old baby girl named Claire. Claire was her first and only child, and like a lot of first-time parents, the mother was very paranoid about her daughter's health. And so anytime there was a change in her behavior or her appearance changed, it was like this mom rushed to the doctor. And that morning, the mother had noticed something very unusual on her daughter's head. There were 2 raised white lines that made the shape of a plus sign. There was one line that ran from the nape of her neck all the way in back, all the way up her head to her forehead, and the other line was horizontal, and it went from behind one ear all the way to the other ear. Now, this mother had no idea what these lines were, what they meant, what caused them, and so as soon as she saw them, she scooped her kid up and she headed to the hospital. Now, in the past, every time this mother had brought Claire to the hospital, the visit always ended with, "Your child is just fine." But this time, when the receptionist saw Claire's head and saw those lines, she immediately said, "Those do not look normal." And so she handed the mother some paperwork and told her they would get Claire to a neurologist as soon as they could. 15 minutes later, the mother stood in an exam room and watched as the hospital's pediatric neurologist, Dr. Farhad Afshar, examined Claire's head. And after a moment, Dr. Afshar stepped back and he explained to the mother that these raised lines on her daughter's head were something known as bulging fontanelles. So when a baby is born, the bones of their skull are not actually fused together yet. And the thin gaps between these separate skull bones are called fontanelles. And Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that when a baby's fontanelles begin to bulge like this, it's usually because the child's brain is so swollen that it's beginning to push the skull bones apart. Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that she had made the right decision to bring her daughter to the hospital. But he was clear that a lot of things can cause a baby's brain to swell and potentially cause these bulging fontanelles, and so in order to figure out what was going on, they would need to order a CAT scan. Claire's mom felt uneasy, but she said okay, and so they did the CT scan, and then a few minutes later, Dr. Afshar came back into the room with the results. And with a grave expression on his face, he told Claire's mother that he had some terrible news. Her daughter had a brain tumor. Hearing this, Claire's mom felt like the entire world was crumbling all around her. She was terrified for her daughter, and she had a million questions. But before she could ask any of them, Dr. Afshar said, "There's something else." He said that normally brain tumors are made up of brain cells. But based on the CT scan, it looked like Claire's tumor inside of her brain was made partially of fat and partially of bone. Dr. Afshar said he had never seen anything like this and couldn't even begin to explain it. But the one thing he did know is that whatever this thing was, it had to come out of Claire. Leaving it inside of her head could at a minimum cause serious neurological damage, or at worst could even kill the child. So Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that she only had really one option. Claire needed brain surgery. Even though the operation was very risky for a child as young as Claire was, it was the only way they could figure out what this mass actually was, and it was the only way to get it out. Soon after their conversation, Dr. Afshar was standing in the operating room with Claire sedated, laying face down on the table in front of him. Dr. Afshar made an incision across the back of Claire's head. Then he cut a rectangle into her skull, essentially creating a small door. He opened up that door to see the bottom of Claire's brain. He delicately moved the left and right hemispheres of Claire's brain slightly apart so he could reach the section where the tumor was. And that's when he got his first glimpse of this strange mass. He grabbed it with a pair of surgical tongs and gently tugged, and he was surprised at how easily it began to slide out. And slowly it came into the light. And when Dr. Afshar finally got a full look at what this thing was, he was so stunned he just froze, staring at this thing that seemed impossible. And so after setting this strange mass aside, Dr. Afshar closed her skull, stitched her head up, and then sent her to the pediatric ICU. Claire laid unconscious in a hospital bed with her mother by her side for weeks. Meanwhile, Dr. Afshar ordered a genetic test on the mass he had removed from Claire's brain. And it turned out Claire was not an only child like her mother thought. She was actually a twin. And the mass that Dr. Afshar had removed from Claire's brain was her twin sibling's fetus. Claire had an extremely rare condition called fetus in fetu. Fetus in fetu occurs in the very early stages of a twin pregnancy, when cells don't divide properly and one fetus becomes enveloped by the other. The enveloping twin looks like a single baby, but they're actually born with their sibling's partially developed fetus still inside of their body. The fetus in Claire's head was 5.5 inches long. It had 2 arms, 2 legs, but its head hadn't formed yet. And Claire's case was extra rare because her twin's fetus was found inside of her skull. In all of global medical history, intracranial fetus in fetu had only ever been recorded 18 other times. And it was thought to be a fatal diagnosis because to this point, all the others who had it had died. But after 2 weeks in the ICU, Claire woke up. And a week after that, she was healthy enough to go back home. And by 18 months old, she had fully recovered and had no lingering neurological problems. As far as the medical literature suggests, Claire was the first person to ever survive having her own twin removed from her brain.
In July of 1848, a 25-year-old man named Phineas Gage got a job working construction on the Hudson River Railroad in New York. At this time in America, railroads were being laid all over the country, and so lots of workers like Phineas were needed to blast rock out of the way to lay down these railroad tracks. And as it happened, Phineas was an expert in explosives. He had learned how to set controlled blasts growing up on his family's farm in New Hampshire, and then later in his life, he had worked in a mine blasting through rock. And so in addition to just being the ideal railroad worker for this time in America, when Phineas actually started working in New York on this railroad, his co-workers immediately started looking up to him. Phineas was extremely smart and energetic. He was this incredible conversationalist. He was charismatic and funny and a natural leader. And so just 2 months into starting this new job, it was no surprise to anyone who knew Phineas or worked with Phineas that he was promoted to blasting foreman, which meant Phineas would lead the explosives team. Phineas was so excited about this promotion that he went to a blacksmith and had a custom tamping iron made. A tamping iron is a long metal rod that's used to pack explosives. When railroad workers wanted to blast through, let's say, a big rock, they would start by drilling a deep but skinny hole in the rock. Then they would pour blasting powder inside, then they'd put a fuse inside, and then using this tamping iron, they would push the blasting powder and the fuse deep into this hole inside of this rock or whatever it was they were blowing up. And then once it was packed, they would ignite it. Usually, tamping irons were sort of rough tools that looked like crowbars, but Phineas really wanted something special to commemorate this promotion. And so Phineas had the blacksmith make this perfectly straight, smooth, 4-foot-long metal tamping iron, and on one end was a pointed side, and on the other was a blunted side. And this rod, it weighed about 13 pounds, and it was about 1.25 inches in diameter. And Phineas loved this tamping iron. He brought it with him not just to work, but basically anywhere he went. On September 3rd, 1848, so not long after Phineas's big promotion, Phineas and his explosives team were blasting through some rock that ran through a forest. And Phineas, he was right up front over the blasting site, helping them prep the explosive. His team had drilled that long, deep, skinny hole into the rock they were about to blow up, and then blasting powder was put inside, a fuse was put inside, and then Phineas took his tamping iron and began packing the powder and fuse deep into the rock. And the way he did this is he used the blunt end of his tamping iron to pack the explosives, which meant the pointed end was sticking out of the rock. And so as Phineas is doing this, someone behind him slipped on a rock. One of his men tripped or something, and so Phineas, with his hands kind of on his tamping iron, turned to the right to look and see what was going on. And when he did this, somehow his tamping iron that was inside of this skinny hole must have nudged against the inside of the rock, created a spark, and ignited the explosive inside of the rock, which meant the tamping iron was basically fired like a missile out of this hole into Phineas's head. It went in his cheek, up behind his left eye, up and out of his skull, and then shot 80 feet away, landing on the ground, covered in Phineas's blood and brains. This happened so quickly that for a second after this thing has blown through Phineas's head, Phineas just stood there upright with his eyes wide, and then suddenly a geyser of blood began shooting out of the top of his head, and then Phineas fell backwards onto the ground. When Phineas's body hit the ground, he began having a seizure, at which point his co-workers, who were still kind of shaken up from this sudden blast, they rushed over and tried to kind of position him in a way that he wouldn't hurt himself. But I mean, they're looking at him and he's literally missing half of his head. He's covered in blood. And they're thinking, there's nothing we can do for him but basically wait for him to die. And so all of Phineas's co-workers, who adored Phineas, just stood there very somber watching their boss die. But eventually, Phineas stopped having a seizure, and then he opened his eyes and he looked up at his crew and he sat up and he said, "What happened?" Now remember, half of his head has been blown out by a 13-pound, 4-foot-long metal rod that has shot through his head. And his co-workers, when they heard how clearly he was speaking and how focused his eyes were, they couldn't believe it. How in the world is this guy alive, let alone having a coherent conversation with them? And so the co-workers told Phineas, "Please lie down, we'll get you help, lie down, relax." But Phineas, who still had blood also shooting out of his head, just kind of stood up casually and walked over to the railroad cart and signaled for his crew to take him back into town. And so the crew, they're looking over at Phineas, who now is literally head to toe just red from blood. Still bleeding, but less so, and he's just sitting on the railroad cart waiting for them. And so they walk over to him and they start the slow 1-mile journey into town on this railroad cart. And the whole time they're all kind of looking at Phineas, expecting him to die any second. But instead, Phineas is just kind of looking around with half of his head. And at some point he pulled out his logbook and carefully wrote down what time they were leaving their work site to make sure his crew was accurately paid. And then finally they reached town and Phineas was still very much alive and looking around, acting like nothing had happened to him. And the co coworkers helped him to his hotel, and Phineas just sat outside on a chair in front of his hotel, just people watching, while his crew went and got a doctor. A doctor soon arrived, and he too was completely shocked at Phineas's appearance, but even more so was Phineas's eyes. He looked at the doctor, and his eyes were totally focused, like he was all there, totally lucid, looking at the doctor, waiting for him to come over and help him out with his little injury. And when the doctor kind of timidly approached Phineas, Phineas very famously said as he sat on his chair, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." Like everyone else, the doctor fully assumed that despite Phineas's miraculous recovery from this injury, that he would soon die from this horrific wound in his head. And so the doctor moved Phineas up into the hotel, put him in a bed, and then basically made him comfortable. Now, the doctor at this point was not trying to save Phineas. He felt like there was nothing he could do to save Phineas. At this point, it was like mercy. Let's make this as pain-free as possible for Phineas as he inevitably dies from this injury. But Phineas didn't die. He would break out of it and basically be okay again. However, his personality at first, after he came out of this state of delirium, was not really the same. No longer was he this funny, smart, charming, confident leader. Instead, he was this guy who seemed to have lost all of his inhibitions and was kind of childlike. He swore all the time. He would tell people he had these crazy plans he was going to go do, but he would never follow through with them. And he would tell his nieces and nephews these wild stories about himself that were obviously made up and not even close to reality. But overall, he was okay, even though you could see his brain pulsing underneath his skin on the side of his head that had been blown off. And within a couple of years of this injury, those changes to Phineas's personality kind of faded, and he really did become old Phineas. However, there was one unique quirk to Phineas post-injury that never went away. And that was Phineas's kind of unhealthy love for the tamping iron that had blown through his head. After his injury, Phineas kind of stopped making friends, and any friends he did have, he really didn't try to keep those relationships up. He didn't get married, he didn't have kids. Instead, the tamping iron became sort of like his best friend. He took it everywhere with him, even posing at one point with the tamping iron the way you would expect a couple to pose for a photo. 12 years after his horrific injury, Phineas would develop seizures, likely from the injury, and then he would die with his beloved tamping rod right by his side. His case changed neuroscience forever by showing that an injury to the brain could affect specific personality traits. Today, Phineas's skull and his tamping rod are on display at Harvard Medical School.
We all like to believe that when we are home behind our shut and locked doors and shut and locked windows, tucked away inside of our bedroom under our covers, that we're safe, that our family members in their bedrooms, they're all safe. But in reality, that's not true. Most of the time it is, and most of the time that illusion of safety is enough that you don't think about it very often, that someone actually could probably break into your house if they wanted to. Not all houses. Some people are much more prepared than others. But most people never have to worry about that actually becoming a reality, someone breaking into their home. But there are people that do live that nightmare, when the place they look at as safe becomes unsafe. Today's story is about someone who believed they lived in a safe house, in a safe neighborhood. But in a moment's notice, that illusion was shattered. Before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious told in story format, well, then you've discovered the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that's your style and you might be interested in something like that, I would encourage you to please gently incinerate keep it together, here we go. Please gently incinerate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In 2017, a woman had just moved in to a beautiful home in Northern California that was just outside the suburbs. It was in kind of a more rural area. You know, there wasn't any street lights. She did have neighbors, but they were, pretty far away from where she was actually staying. But she loved it, and it was this beautiful area. She'd go outside at night on her porch, and she'd look up, and because there wasn't much light pollution, she could see the stars, and she just loved it. And even though she didn't see her neighbors very often, she knew them. They were older. They were really nice. It was just like a really warm, welcoming neighborhood, albeit people enjoyed their space, but it was safe. And it was a place that she truly loved and didn't expect to move anytime soon. Later that year, in the winter, she got home from work one day. She had a long shift. She was exhausted, and she pulls into her driveway, and when she steps out, she immediately smelled cigarette smoke. She didn't smoke. She didn't think her neighbors smoked. It was not a high-trafficked area. I mean, they're in kind of this rural part of Northern California, and her street, the only people that really ever went on it were her and her neighbors. And so she was thinking, like, who was smoking near my house? But it was really, really foggy this day. She could barely see, even when she was pulling into her driveway, she could only see what her headlights had illuminated on her house. I mean, it was like no visibility. She kind of glanced around, but she was like, you know what? I'm so tired. I just want to go to bed. So she just kind of forgets about the cigarette smoke, wasn't really that concerned about it, and goes in her house. And even though it's like 7 o'clock, she's like, I'm just going to go to bed. So she heads upstairs, takes a shower, and gets in bed. A couple hours later, she wakes up because she thinks she hears something on her first floor. At the time, she had a close friend that was taking classes in the city, but working outside of the city, and sometimes didn't have enough time to get back to his house to shower and clean up before work. And so she'd actually given him a set of her keys so that at odd hours when he was going between classes and work, he could just come to her house, take a shower, get changed. It was just a lot easier for him, and they were close enough, it wasn't a big deal. But he always texted her before he came to her house as a courtesy. Hey, I'm going to be there taking a shower, using your house just for a minute. And they rarely actually ran into each other because his hours were so strange. So when she wakes up and hears commotion downstairs, the first thing she does is check her phone for a text message because she's assuming that it's her friend who's just, stopped by to use the shower or change or whatever he's going to do. So she reaches over to her bedside table, grabs her phone, and she opens it, and it blinded her because she's just woken up, and she kind of squinted at her phone, and she couldn't really tell if there was any unread messages from him or not, but she just put her phone down and decided she would yell out, just a lot faster than trying to read this text message. So she yells out to him, and there's silence downstairs. And she yells out again, hey, is that you? And there's silence. And then all of a sudden she hears very loud footsteps running across the first floor, charging up the stairs. She instinctively leaps out of bed, runs into her closet, which is right across from her bed. And as soon as she's literally stepping into the closet, she can hear whoever was downstairs now is in the hallway upstairs. And so the layout upstairs is there's a bedroom on the left, a bedroom on the right of the hallway, and straight ahead at the end, there's a bathroom. And the 2 bedroom doors were shut. The bathroom door was open. This person bombed up the stairs and ran right past the bedroom doors, one of them she was in, straight to the bathroom. It allowed her an opportunity to pop open the attic crawl space that the access was inside of her closet. She pops that open and is able to clamber up into the attic, and is literally, her feet are still being sucked up into the attic as whoever that was, they realize she's not in the bathroom, and they started charging back down. They punch open the door that she's in, and they charge into her bedroom. She's trying to suck her legs up into the attic crawl space. She gets him up just in time, and as her knees sucked up against her chest, when he comes into her bedroom, flips on the light, and opens the closet. From her vantage point, she's looking down, and just because of the way the view was obscured, she could only make out that it was someone wearing like kind of tattered jeans with the cuffs rolled up and dirty work boots. This was definitely not her friend. And as she's looking at his shoes and pants, wondering if he's gonna poke his head in and look up and see this crawl space where she is, and she has nothing she can do. If he decided to reach up and get her, there's nowhere for her to go. She didn't have her phone, it was on the bedside table, and she's just hoping that he doesn't see her. Luckily, he turns around and starts rummaging through everything in her bedroom, basically looking for her. Flips the bed over, knocks over the dresser, and then he screams this loud scream of frustration. And as he's screaming, she pushes the little crawl space cover over the spot. So now she's completely tucked away inside of the crawl space, and she can't see anything. And for the next several hours, this person was literally screaming.
and running around the house, punching walls, screaming, "Where are you?" Running down the hall, reopening the bathroom, going into the other bedroom, clearly knocking things over, just going crazy looking for this girl. And then it slowed down and she heard him walking around the house, and he would say periodically,
"Gonna find you. No, you haven't left yet. I'm gonna find you."
And she started smelling cigarette smoke. He was smoking inside of her house. And then she realized that he was probably at her house when she first got in. That's why she smelled the cigarette smoke. For hours, she huddled inside of this attic crawl space that realistically is a little bit obscured inside of the closet. You would need to be looking for it to see it. And she just hoped that he didn't find her. And so she started counting. She figured, if I can just count to 1,000 with silence downstairs, if I can do that, that means he's probably gone. And so she would start counting, and she'd get to like 200, and then she'd hear him whispering or yelling or knocking something over, and she'd go back down to 0. And so all night, she basically would try to count to 1,000 until finally she did, without it being interrupted. It was probably like 5 or 6 in the morning. So it's been hours and hours of this guy looking for her in her house. And she believed that it was safe enough for her to open up the attic crawl space and kind of peek back into the room. And so she moves the attic crawl space, the little square piece of wood that blocks the crawl space, she lifts it up and moves it. And she can now see that just from her little vantage point to where his feet were, that she could see before, that clearly things have been broken. There's glass on the ground. She can see there's clothes on the ground. And she wriggles down. There's no sign of him. It's been a while since she heard him. And she darts across her now destroyed bedroom. Her bed's been flipped. Things have been broken. There's holes in the wall. She gets her phone and goes right back in the crawl space. She calls the police and is like whispering as she's talking to them, because now she's worried that maybe he heard her and he's going to come back. She really doesn't know if he's gone. She just knew she had to call the police. Otherwise, she was dead if he was still there. She gets the police on the phone. They say, "We'll be right there. Stay where you are." The police show up and she can hear them entering the house. They're yelling, "Police, we're coming inside." They search the whole house and they start yelling for her. They start yelling for her by name. And at this point, she feels comfortable opening up the crawl space and coming down to show herself. Sure enough, there's the police and they're like, "There's nobody here. Do you want to walk around the house and see if anything was taken?" Every room was completely trashed. Holes in the wall, things broken. Whoever this was looking for her everywhere in the house and was basically rummaging through everything to try to find her. And the police are like, "You're very lucky that you thought to jump into that crawl space, because we found a number of your knives from your butcher block have been taken out. They were scattered around the house. It seems like he might have grabbed a knife and then in frustration was maybe looking for you and slashing at different things. Then he'd throw a knife and get another one. It's pretty clear this person was trying to do you harm, and you're very lucky that you had the wherewithal to immediately, when you heard those running footsteps, charge into the closet and hide in the attic. That almost definitely saved your life. Although she would stay at this house for another 3 years after the incident, it ultimately proved to be too difficult to stay in that house. She was constantly afraid that it was going to happen again. It was very traumatic, and so she ultimately moved. So it just goes to show that while we believe we are safe when we are home, the reality is all those locks and cameras and all the stuff we install around our house to keep ourselves safe, that's really just to keep the honest people out. The monsters out there, the evil people that want to do us harm, they don't care about breaking windows and forcing their way in. So you should always have a plan of what you would do if someone broke into your home, how you would handle it, whether it is an escape plan or even concealed weapons. But you should do something to protect yourself and have a plan in case the worst case scenario happens to you. So that's going to do it.
Same road home, same city lights, red lights changing through the windshield at night. The seat beside me stays untouched, but somehow it still feels occupied. Time kept moving, street kept moving, street after street, but some memories never miss a beat. You're still sitting.
Connection unstable, but I'm still here. Your face in the blue light
guys, if you enjoyed the story today, if you would please gently incinerate the like button and then also subscribe and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3 to 4 weekly uploads. If you want to reach out to me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is